Hi everybody, my name is Richard Khleif, and I lead Communications and Customer Survey for Oracle's Global Support Organization. Today we're going to talk about critical thinking and decision making, which are two very important skills to develop alongside technical expertise that is evolving through your studies. We're going to start off by looking at some definitions of critical thinking, identifying some challenges to effective decision making, and then moving straight into what we can do about that. Different tactics that you can utilize both professionally and personally to make strong decisions. Let's get started. Critical thinking is a topic on a lot of people's minds these days, so to speak. And according even to billionaire tech mogul Mark Cuban, it's going to be one of the most sought after skills in the marketplace in the future. So being able to develop that capability concurrently with technical skills is a really great way to ensure long-term career success. If you have a few minutes, watch this video. The URL is embedded in the bottom left-hand corner, and see what Mark has to say in context. So here's a situation where critical thinking would really hold one in good stead. On this graph, you see a close statistical relationship between per capita cheese consumption over a period of time and the number of people who died by becoming entangled in their own bed sheets over that same period of time. And while the graph shows a close relationship between those two phenomena, a critical thinker would step back and look beneath the surface and say, is there a material relationship between those two phenomena? And of course, determine that that is not the case. So while a little bit simplistic and possibly a bit humorous, this gives us a great example of an application for critical thinking skills. It's important to note that most of us don't get focused instruction on thinking about our thinking. It's not a skill that's typically taught in standard school curricula. A lot of times, the way we think is really guided by our personal experiences, separate personality traits, the daily interactions that we've had over the course of our lives, and of course receive strong inputs from the environments in which we interact, in which we exist. That can be linguistic, that can be the family, that can be the institutions of which we're a part, whether educational or otherwise, and also assessing your own thinking skills may be a new paradigm for folks. If you think about how well you breathe, and how did you learn to both breathe and assess your breathing at the same time, athletes and others among us will say it's really a question of techniques and approaches that we self-consciously take to refine those skills. Otherwise, sometimes they develop largely unconsciously over time. From the standpoint of business culture, there are really specific priorities that you'll experience as you make your way into the working world. There are values placed on both decisiveness and the quality of decisions. Businesses are always looking for results on the bottom line. And the process that you go through to think about a problem or a situation or an opportunity is judged largely by outcomes, not usually as an asset or an object unto itself. In other words, people want to see what you produce, but they're not as interested in the business world of always understanding the process you went through to get to that decision and that outcome, good, bad, or indifferent. It's important to know yourself and to know why you act in the way that you act or think in the way that you think. The three functions our minds perform are thinking, which helps us to make sense of the world, feeling, which tells us how we're doing, and wanting, which drives or motivates us to act in the way that we do. These relate to our own egos and our senses of being, our senses of well-being. And oftentimes we look at the world through lenses wherein we characterize things as true because we individually believe it to be true, or because we collectively in our groups and communities believe it to be true. Other times we see things and we believe them because we want to believe them, or that we've always believed them, or because it's in our selfish best interests to believe them. Now, some of the predicaments that come out of that is that things can be looked at as true because somebody else believes it and told us about it, or because we think someone else believes it, or because we individually think that we believe it. So if there are situations at work that you're confronted with where you think, well, I can't take this idea to the next level because somebody will reject it, you don't know that unless you try or unless you feel it out a little bit. So it's important to avoid some of these predicaments as a baseline in the way you think critically. So we've talked a little bit now about fundamentals of what critical thinking means. And I'd like to move more into the realm of decision making now, how we take our ideas about critical thinking and apply them with the help of a book called Decisive, How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work, written by Chip and Dan Heath. Now, the Heath brothers begin by identifying 4 thinking characteristics that can be obstacles to strong decisions. They get in the way of strong decisions. And they call these the 4 villains of decision making. The first one is about perspective. It's about narrow framing. So in a narrow framing context, we define our choices far too narrowly, usually ending up in binary terms of only having an either-or choice. And oftentimes, narrow framing is focused on surface-level situations, not on the broader picture, and can really limit the ability to make a strong decision. The second villain is confirmation bias, where we develop a very, very quick belief about a situation by using or seeking information that only strengthens the belief that we already have at the expense of other information. And oftentimes a confirmation bias can feel and look scientific due to the use of hard data or supposed facts to support our positions. So if you think back to the initial slide we looked at that brought in cheese consumption and bedsheet entanglement, those hard facts, if we saw them and believed there was a correlation, would be very difficult in a confirmation bias setting to break. The third of the villains is short-term emotion, where our feelings churn and we replay the same arguments about a situation over and over in our heads. And none of the information that we're using to make a decision changes, but at the same time our brains are reeling and continually reassessing our positions and the facts of a situation, so to speak. It often clouds our judgment when we let the way we feel in the heat of the moment take over. So short-term emotion, the third villain. The fourth of the villains is overconfidence, where we think we know more than we do about what the future will hold for us. We examine information that's close by to arrive at decisions, and we draw potentially incorrect conclusions from that information. And one of the real characteristics of overconfidence is that we don't understand or realize yet that we don't know what we don't know. So in short, you have, again, the 4 villains: narrow framing, confirmation bias, short-term emotion, and overconfidence. Now let's move into some discussions about how we overcome these villains. To overcome the 4 villains that we just talked about, the Heath brothers suggest that we get them under wraps, so to speak. And WRAP is an acronym that is made up of the solutions to each of the villains. The first of these is to widen our options in order to overcome narrow framing. We have to think in terms of and, not just either or when we're looking at our choices, because we don't want to miss the forest for the trees. To overcome confirmation bias, the Heath suggests that we reality test our assumptions. And part of that involves asking better questions and cross-analyzing data from different sources so we don't shortchange a stronger outcome without even knowing it exists. To overcome short-term emotion, we need to attain distance before deciding, to step away from the middle of the fray, think outside of our existing frames of reference so we don't get analysis paralysis and don't get too caught up in our own heads to move forward and be effective. To overcome overconfidence, we need to prepare to be wrong. And that means not relying solely on our own opinions and perspectives or our past experiences. We have to avoid being cocky or lazy or both, and we can't expect to be successful without fully understanding a situation. And that means broadening the data that we bring in and being okay with the fact that we may not have been correct to begin with. For the remainder of the presentation, I'd like to focus on some specific methods for using the WRAP principles and overcoming the 4 villains of decision-making. The first that I want to present is the Vanishing Options test, where the Heaths encourage us to ask, what else could or would I do if I couldn't choose any of the decision-making options I'm currently considering? Doing this helps to generate additional courses of actions for us that transcend the kind of either or, whether or not thinking that we might be subject to, and it helps us avoid other decision-making traps relative to narrow framing. Taking these seemingly obvious options off the table really challenges us to think differently about a situation. It helps to widen our frame of reference and helps to expand the spotlights that we cast on particular phenomena. So think to yourself, are there areas where the Vanishing Options test could help you make a decision, either at work, at school, or in other aspects of your life? The second example that I wanted to provide is how to get proactive with playlists. And the Heaths define playlists as encoded advice or experiences that create a list of questions to ask or principles to refer back to or ideas to consider. And the elements within a playlist can be based on our own experiences and findings, or they can be inputs received from other people, life experiences that others have shared with us, both individually or from within or outside of an organization. So playlists really help to turn a reactive search in terms of who has solved my problem into a more proactive step that says we've already found the people who have solved this problem and here's what they said. So it's different than a checklist because checklists really stop people from making an error, where playlists are designed to stimulate new ideas. So think about this as well in terms of some of the work you might be doing for school right now, projects, different applications you're writing, whatever it might be. If you get to a challenging point, where can you turn to get inputs that may help you and you may draw from at different points in time? One of my favorite methods that the Heaths introduce in their book is that of laddering up. And this is really an approach to unsticking a stalled creative process or decision-making process by relying on progressively more abstract or seemingly unrelated information in order to find solutions. Now, in this model of the ladder, the lower rungs offer or represent a view of situations that are similar to the ones we're in. And any solutions that might be apparent at those lower rungs offer us typically a high probability of success since the conditions are similar and the solutions have been tested and proven. Now, the Heaths suggest that if that's not enough for what you're trying to achieve, that you climb sort of higher up this metaphorical ladder. And the higher you go, the more options and inputs you'll get from other realms. But those options will also require big leaps of faith and a strong imagination in order to make them relevant to your situation. And these higher rungs not only offer the promise of a big breakthrough, but they also have a high probability of failure, given that it's a stretch sometimes to apply the concepts from other realms to your decision-making situation. One of the great examples they provide in the book is of a woman who was hired by a swimwear company to create faster swimsuits for athletes to help give them a performance edge. Now, instead of necessarily studying historical textile composition, she said to herself, what goes fast in water? And she settled on torpedoes and sharks. And in studying shark skin, recognized that there were small ridges on the skin. It was not completely smooth. And those ridges helped the sharks go more quickly as they propelled themselves through the water. So she created prototypes of a material that mimicked shark skin by having these sort of rough ridges on them. And the company gave them to athletes to test, and sure enough, it made them much faster in the water and gave them the edge that they were looking for. So that's a great example of how laddering up can be applied to a variety of situations. There are lots of different ways that we can reality test our assumptions. And one that the Heaths bring up in the book is to inject faults into a process or approach on purpose to see what happens. Now, as many of you will attest, we're rarely, if ever, going to perform full testing of a decision or an assumption in a live or production environment. So we're often left to guess at what any negative consequences or outcomes could be. So there's one way to do this. It's not the most conservative way to do this by any means, but you can deliberately sabotage a process or situation by introducing an unsafe stimulus into the mix to see what reaction occurs. Now, ultimately, if the negative consequence we assumed was going to take place actually is noted, then our assumptions were correct to begin with. If the outcome we get is less negative, or even positive, perhaps even neutral, then our assumptions were inaccurate to begin with, and we effectively reality tested them. Now, again, this is a very risky tactic and should only be done in highly controlled environments, but it can yield some good outcomes in the process. There might be situations you're facing where you're trying to test a driver or you're writing a different program, and you insert code into that to see what happens when you actually run it, compile it, and run it. You may configure hardware in a way to see whether or not it's compatible or what sort of access issues you have as a consequence of that. So there are different ways to do it in labs, in controlled places, but it's something to think about in order to reality test what you believe might happen. To overcome confirmation bias and reality test some of our perceptions, the Heaths offer the idea of ooching. And an ooch is a small experiment that's designed to test a theory or a diagnostic to really verify what we think might occur. And what it does is help ensure that we overcome our confirmation biases and don't overemphasize our own faith in our powers of prediction. You'll be very familiar with this concept in the frame of alpha testing, beta testing, and proofs of concept prior to large-scale cutovers or deployments or reconfigurations. So the point of an ooch is to really help dip a toe in the water, so to speak, to see whether or not our assumptions and the biases we have towards particular outcomes are in fact borne out when we experiment our way or slowly step our way towards that ultimate outcome. There are often times that we approach decisions with a great deal of emotion, whether positive excitement or negative feelings or whatever it might be. And so to combat the threat of short-term emotions taking over, the 10-10-10 method created by writer Susie Welsh helps us to step back and assess how we're going to feel about a decision across 3 different time frames. First is really short-term. So how would we feel if we went the route we think we're going to go in 10 minutes? Then how would we feel about that decision in 10 months? And ultimately, how would we feel about that decision in 10 years? Now, if done correctly, these 3 different time frames help us to step back and assess the potential outcomes through both a broader frame of reference and one that's also longer term. And it also assists us in leveling the emotional playing field, getting through that short-term emotion, because those emotions can be intense and sharp, and oftentimes the future can be a little bit fuzzier and help us to step back and get over those feelings that we have in the moment. Now, the longest-term perspective may not always be the right one for a particular decision-making situation, but if you at least think through the 10-10-10 model, it helps us to ensure that those short-term emotions are overcome, our frames are wider, and the things we're feeling and seeing in the moment are not the only ones that we're considering. The 4th villain, which is overconfidence, can be mitigated by preparing to be wrong. So one of the things that we need to think about is how to incorporate safety factors into our predictions and analyses. To do so successfully, we've got to step back and assume that unforeseen things will enter into our plans. Know that we're being overconfident and add in a margin of error to any calculations we have. A couple of examples include the fact that elevator cables are manufactured to be 11 times stronger than they need to be in order to hold a fully burdened elevator over a period of time. Another example is that Microsoft builds a 30% completion time buffer into its software engineering release schedules to account for any snags, bugs, or unforeseen challenges that may occur in the process. So the net point is that anticipating these problems also helps us to cope with them if they should occur in the first place. So think about how to add safety factors into the decisions that you make each day. The final method I want to discuss today is that of the Tripwire, which is a methodology that the Heath suggests as a way to, again, overcome overconfidence and help us to prepare to be wrong. Now, in life, we naturally slip into very automatic modes of thinking and planning and deciding and acting. And while we believe we can keep all the elements of our busy lives top of mind, sometimes we need a gentle reminder to revisit a particular situation. So a tripwire serves as that reminder to help jog us out of the autopilot mode that we're in and into a state of consciousness about something so we can check on its progress, or that we can reinforce to ourselves that we have choices in a given situation. An example of this would be from the band Van Halen, who in their big touring days used to always ask for a very large jar of M&M's candy to be put in their dressing rooms, and that every brown M&M be removed from that jar of candy. Now, the conventional wisdom at the time was that Van Halen were just being difficult rock stars, when in fact they were using the brown M&Ms as a tripwire to see how thoroughly the management companies and stage crews had read their contracts. They have a lot of lights, they had a lot of heavy materials that were suspended in the air and built up, so they felt that if they put this clause about removing brown M&Ms deep in the pages of the contract, and those M&Ms weren't in the candy jar when they got to the dressing room, that people had read it thoroughly and that they would feel safer in actually going out and playing on the stage without risk. I'd like to leave you with some final thoughts from Chip and Dan Heath about being decisive. They say that being decisive is a choice. Decisiveness is a way of behaving, not an inherited trait. It allows us to make brave and confident choices, not because we know we'll be right, but because it's better to try and fail than to delay and regret. And the right choice at the right moment can make all the difference. Coupled with our foundational information about critical thinking and some of the concepts we used as a springboard to move into decision-making discussions, I hope that this presentation provides you value and provides you methodologies that you can employ in your life and in your work on a go-forward basis. If you'd like to further explore the topics we covered today, the links on this related reading page should help you to get a firm foundation and move forward in your studies of critical thinking and decision-making. Thank you again for your time, and best of luck in all future endeavors.